Sheriff Hutton is a small village which lies a little to the north of the city of York. Before the Normans, the manor was split between several landowners. After the invasion, some of the land was retained by the crown, and other parts given to Count Robert of Mortain. He installed Sir Nigel Fossard as lord of the manor. Soon after this, it passed into the possession of the Bulmer family, and during the reign of King Stephen it was Bertram Bulmer who in 1140 built a modern Bailey castle. After the civil war between Stephen and Matilda, the castle and manor was seized by the crown, before being held for the king by the Morley family, before eventually passing into the possession of the Neville family in the 14th century. An impressive stone castle was built at the western end of the village by John, 3rd Baron Neville, in the late 14th century, and this castle was used by Richard III to house his nephew, Edward, Earl of Warwick, and his niece, Elizabeth of York. The castle fell into disrepair during the reign of King James I and is today a protected ruin in private hands, and I admit I have not as yet been able to explore and investigate there. The Church of St Helen and the Holy Cross has a 12th century origin and lies at the extreme eastern end of Sheriff Hutton village, next to the remains of the early Norman ringwork castle. To the back and to the left there is a medieval tomb. Two, in fact. One of an armoured knight. The other one is often stated to be that of Richard III's son, Edward, who died at the age of 11 at Middleham, while Richard and Anne were in Nottingham.
In the following month of April, on a day not very far distant from the anniversary of King Edward, this only son of his, in whom all the hopes of the royal succession, fortified with so many oaths, were centred, was seized with an illness of but short duration, and died at Middleham Castle, in the year of our Lord, 1484, being the first of the reign of the said King Richard. On hearing the news of this, at Nottingham, where they were then residing, you might have seen his father and mother in a state almost bordering on madness, by reason of their sudden grief.
This identification is however probably erroneous, and this identification can be traced to J.W. Clay in 1904, who, in editing the church notes of the antiquarian Roger Dodsworth, first made this tentative suggestion for the tomb's identification. This was based on nothing more than the Neville heraldry on the monument, and in the stained glass of the church. This notion was however quickly taken up with enthusiasm by later commentators, and has often been uncritically accepted, although it has been more challenged in recent years. Dr. Jane Crease observes that the effigy wears a robe, possibly furred at the hem, and a soft cap. The feet and supporters are missing, and the face is much weathered but seems to be rounded, with no facial hair, and this could be interpreted as being that of a juvenile. No colour is now visible on the tomb, but the Neville arms were reliably recorded on it in 1623. As to Edward, well, the contemporary accounts in the 1480s of the death and burial of Edward of Middleham place him at Middleham, possibly being buried at Middleham or nearby Coverham Abbey, where we know that some notable Nevilles were buried. There is absolutely no record of a journey to Sheriff Hutton at this time. And so, it is to the Nevilles of nearby Sheriff Hutton Castle that we should probably look for an identification for this tomb, should one be possible, that is. The history aside, now we delve into the paranormal aspects of the church. In 1974, Joan Forman, a dramatist and writer of many books on ghosts and the paranormal, was researching a play on the life of King Richard. And she visited the tomb at Sheriff Hutton, which she believed, as many did at that time, that it was of Edward. She stresses that she was not trying to provoke a paranormal experience, but was
concentrating on the tomb, in an attempt to understand intuitively the feelings of the parents as they themselves had presumably stood there many years before.
As she placed her hands over the stone image, she heard the door open, but not the sound of it closing. Then she heard footsteps apparently coming through the church, which was, she admits, an irritation as she wanted time alone there to feel the place. When no one approached her, she assumed that another visitor to the church was politely staying back and giving her space. Joan Forman believed that whoever had entered was at that moment out of her sight, perhaps behind one of the large pillars. Also at that moment, she heard one or two mumbled words which she couldn't quite make out, and felt strangely riveted to the spot for a time. Eventually she left the area and walked up the aisle, prepared to apologise to whomever was there for monopolising the tomb for so long. But there was no one in the church, and the large church door was closed rather than open as she had expected from what she had heard. She also stood and listened for the clock mechanism to see if that could have caused the noise that she had heard, but the clock had stopped. The only person she could see was a gardener mowing the lawn some 250 yards away in the churchyard. My first visit to this particular church took place in 1990, whilst a first-year undergraduate at the University of York. I was with the rest of my year conducting an archaeological survey on the Ridge and Furrow field system, adjacent to the Norman ringwork. At lunchtime, while the rest of the class decamped to the local pub, and with a possible migraine coming on, I went and sat quietly in the darker church. Although the necessity was to get away from the sun for a while, I was also taking the opportunity to see if there were any spirits around in the church. I found it a contemplative place, very quiet, a little cold, and with that particular musty, slightly damp smell of the old English parish church. I walked around and found the interesting medieval sarcophagus and took some photographs. Then I sat down and was just quiet for a while as the pain in my head began to subside. After some minutes I heard the clunk of the large door handle on the church's door and the sound of the door opening. The tomb, as I've said, is on the left of the church and near the back, and the door was out of sight to me. I assumed that this was one of the other students who had come into the church, and naturally I was starting to get a little apprehensive that my nice solitude was about to be shattered. I don't remember any sound of the door closing either. Then I heard slow clop-clop footsteps, as though of a woman's wooden soles on stone flagstones. They got slightly louder as they approached down the central aisle. They stopped and turned and continued to where I was sitting by the tomb. I had the distinct impression, coupled with the sound of the steps, that this was a female. The footsteps stopped about 3 feet away from me at the head end of the sarcophagus. The air at that moment went cold. I couldn't see her, but I knew she was there. And there was such a sadness being emitted from that spot so close to me. For 2 minutes or a little more, the sad woman and I kept company by the stone sarcophagus in absolute silence. Until there came the clonk of the church door lock, followed by the squeal of the door opening, and 2 of my classmates entered noisily. The coldness instantly vanished, and she was gone. I visited this church on a subsequent occasion about a year later, and sat quietly in the same spot on a lunchtime just as before, but the footsteps and the atmosphere did not manifest again.